I always make the upfront assumption that people working in sustainability really care. They do want to see emissions go down. They do want to see us not destroy planet Earth. They want an equal access to human well-being for 9 billion people on planet Earth. And if that's true, we'll have to factor in a limit on economic size into your work.
So welcome back, everybody. Rich Vicker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here to another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with sustainable leaders about the work they're doing, path they're on, and how they got into this career. And with that, I'm really excited to be joined by John Mulrow, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Degrowth Institute. And additionally, he's also the adjunct professor of environmental and ecological engineering at Purdue University, where through that position, he's also doing a lot of research basically with the aim to improve the environmental assessment by accounting for social outcomes and biophysical limits to economic growth. For me, it's a really great time to be having these topics. Obviously, we know about planetary limits being, overrun, and we know about things around CO2. And so he's really taking a very different view of what the solutions are. It's not just, dialing back a little bit of carbon in the supply chain. It's actually a rethink about what growth is, about what productivity is, and about many of the bigger topics. And so it's a great time to be having these discussions, particularly as we're having so many about what are the first principles of sustainability. And so with that, John, thank you very much for taking the time. It's really great to have you here on the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast.
Thanks, Rich. Looking forward to the conversation. You already hit on a bunch of points.
All right, man. So as a starting point, it'd be great to hear a little about you, personal introduction, and the work that you're on.
Really quick, I've taken a winding path through the world of sustainability to get to degrowth. I spent a few years abroad working on off-grid solar installations. I've done climate advocacy in Washington, D.C. I worked for many years on the West Coast in San Francisco doing sustainability consulting for large corporations and government entities. All that work raised a lot of questions. And one of the questions I like to frame it is, what happens to the savings? Came back to Chicago, moved back home to do a PhD to ask that question. And while I was doing that work, what happens to the potential savings from electric vehicles, which is what my dissertation was about, came across the degrowth movement as a kind of consolidation space for different sectors and efforts and activists to challenge endless economic growth.
So what is the Degrowth Institute? Like, what's the mission? What's the vision? What's the work that you guys are doing?
So the Degrowth Institute's mission is to empower the sustainability movement to challenge endless economic growth. And we advocate for degrowth as an intentional downscaling of the global economy for the purpose of ecological sustainability, which we've been working hard on, and social justice.
What is the definition for degrowth in the way that you see it, in the way that you practice it?
For us, it has a definition in terms of what the action of degrowth is, and that's an intentional downscaling of the global economy for the purpose of meeting ecological sustainability and social justice goals. Degrowth is also a movement working on what that means for the future. So if we were to actually commit to global economic downscaling, how would that work? And how would we progress as a society through that action? There's a lot of people working on that aspect. I think we're still missing folks who are saying intentional global economic downscaling is going to require a massive diversity of people to take their current work that they're doing in their current sector and add the idea of global economic downscaling to their work. And so degrowth is also the effort to compile that information, brainstorm, work together, make those connections, and kind of open up, I think, as the degrowth movement, if you could think of it as a coherent set of vocabularies, the Earth movement would say, open up the imagination to a limit on economic size, done justly and ecologically, and get people to start working towards that.
Given that, how do you distinguish degrowth from sustainability, post-growth, circular economy frameworks? These are all things that we've discussed in the past. They're also just like degrowth and regen and others. Like there's like this new wave of kind of theories and frameworks and professionals that are coming in trying to, to drive a different model. how do you either separate, or are there certain things that you actually believe are they're common in core, but it's a different tactic? Like how do you see that?
Well, I guess I would ask, do you mean there's a new wave of sustainability buzzwords coming out,
No, I mean, honestly,
of which
I think
degrowth is
some of
one
it
of
could,
them?
I think some of it could turn into buzzwords if there's no action behind it, or there's no actual traction behind the framework themselves. But I think, like, I kind of look at it in a way as also like you're walking out of a movie theater, you can only see so much, and that's what we've been focusing on for a long time. Now we're nailing some of that stuff down. We're nailing down carbon, we're nailing down water, we're nailing down circularity, and now we can actually broaden the spectrum. But like, okay, now we kind of looked at these, say, technical, tactical, finite, like very focused things, we can actually have bigger conversations again, which is kind of where sustainability started 20 years ago when I got into it. It's like it was really like this big construct. And I feel like this, as well as some others, they're coming back to like what's the big questions we should be asking, or like someone says like the first principles of sustainability again. Like we've kind of lost that path. So for me, it's I don't call it buzzwords, and I won't say that these are in any way pithy. Like I view like some of them are going to make real progress, and I'm curious, like how do you view yourself within this current environment of a number of these different kind of frameworks or theories, or like donut economics? Like there's different economic theories that are coming out. How do you view yourself within that? And are you all trying to share, or are you all trying to solve similar things and it's a matter of tactics? Or do you see degrowth as something totally different than, and fundamentally, like, not, I won't say opposed to, but just it's a complete separation from circularity or from sustainability? Like those are things that are like, that's defense. I'm talking a whole different thing.
The Limits to Growth report was published in 1971. Right? The conversation about are the economy and ecological sustainability mutually exclusive? Do they fundamentally conflict with each other? Can we have both? We went through those conversations have been had. And I think that the sustainability movement, if you could consider it one thing, made a kind of shift, a macro shift at some point to say, we're not winning hearts and minds with the limits message. So we need to lean into the growth message. And so, yes, we are swinging. In many ways, degrowth is a revisit or a critique of that process and kind of a calculating or accounting of the outcomes. And what we're saying is that the outcome was the savings from all that hard work got eaten up by global economic growth. I mean, CO2 at a global scale did not go down over the last 20 years. It maybe went down for Stanford University on a per person basis or something like that. We have tons of localized wins in the sustainability outcomes, tons of localized wins for the circular economy, but the macro picture is not getting better. And so degrowth, it kind of uses that whole experience to build up a new vocabulary. It's like now we have some experience under our belt. We can reframe these arguments, and we can also point to a lived experience of working very hard, very genuinely caring about global sustainability and not getting the outcomes because the macroeconomic picture, the critique of endless growth was not in the room.
But I'm curious, like, do you think that sustainability as a movement, as an industry, as a profession has then failed? Like, is it just not done enough, or is it we just haven't given it enough time? Because, like, I can say, like, the U.S. is their carbon has peaked. China has now theoretically peaked as of last year. India is still rising. Vietnam is still rising. Africa still, as a continent, is still going to rise. So, is it that it didn't work? It's not working at the scale we need. Like, what's the problem that you go back to on sustainability, and some of like what your observations were?
We say very explicitly, and I'll reference some of our Degrowth Institute content for you later in this discussion. But one of the phrases we say is that sustainability needs to evolve to challenge endless economic growth. And so instead of treating it like it didn't work, let's rethink, as if it was one coherent single program led by Al Gore and Paul Hawken or something. it's just an evolution. It's the next understanding. We had triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, save money, save the planet. Then we've had the kind of nested dependencies version, which is the economy is a subset of society. Society is a subset of the environment, and that's good for stimulating like understanding of the circular economy and how we could make industries more like nature. But none of those messages challenged the size of the whole global economy and brought together different indicators and different cultures and different political perspectives to challenge economic growth. To me, that's the next evolution for sustainability as a true and committed effort to not destroy the planet and make sure it's livable for all humans across the earth in an equitable way. That version of sustainability has to evolve to challenge economic growth.
And then when it comes to say economic growth itself, if the idea is to bring that back or to move away from it, does this require new definitions for sustain or kind of for success and prosperity? Because a lot of governments, they look at prosperity as a function of GDP, economic growth, which can therefore pay for healthcare, education, da 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 da. Right? Like they really tie themselves to that. So does this require a reframing for success and prosperity as a starting point? Because if it's going to be just, you have to kind of move away from one and into another. How does that fit into the working definitions or into the structure of degrowth?
On questions like this that are somewhat existential, um, we like to ask for who? Who's asking that question? I mean, who's asking the who are we trying to provide new metrics of success for? Because the metric of GDP growth represents success for a certain type of person, but there's a lot of people across the world who would never bring up GDP as a measure of success for them. I think it was the Post Growth Institute, which is based here in the U.S., reposting something from the Wellbeing Alliance, and it was saying that the tagline was, "We don't need a new economy, we need a new economy." And the first new was NEW, the second new was KNEW. So we need to bring back things we kind of inherently know, or cultures and communities around the world already practice, which is living better within limits, living better with less, living better in a way that's measuring our success not by the hopes of growth.
Well, and I guess the reason why I bring in like the context of what I see, say, like in my recent trip in Nepal, there's a few people in that country that are obviously at the top end, and they're looking at, say, let's just call it assets and the appreciation of, and therefore wealth generation. But then there's a whole nother middle class that's like, look, I just want to build a small business so I can make enough money to put my kid through a better school, so I can live in the city and have access to better healthcare. And that's economic growth, and they don't call it GDP, but it's prosperity, right? So if we're going to kind of shift away from economic growth at the macro level, or you want to bring that back, like what happens to that group? Like I know the top 1%, the top 5%. I know like that's one conversation. I'm just, what's the prosperity that you're selling or that you're bringing to the global middle class, who are just trying to have a better life for their children, for themselves, for their elderly?
So there's researchers working on this question, but I say we got to go back to the mission, because our main goal is to challenge people like you, Rich, sustainability professionals, and people who watch this podcast to bring in the macroeconomic context to whatever they're doing. So anybody who's out there selling energy efficient light bulbs and zero waste efforts, which is work that I did for major corporations and government entities for many years, and saying save money, save the planet, and not asking what happens to those savings and how can those savings be allocated to true sustainability and not gross growth.
When you say the savings, are you talking about in the company, or are you talking about more outside the company? Like how do you frame that, and what are you trying to get them to think through or think through differently as part of your engagement with them? Say just on those very issues, like, hey man, we're already doing this. We got a carbon zero target. We have a blah blah blah. We're SBTI. We're doing the work. How do you come in and how do you work with them?
One of the ways that I would now, how I used to work that with them is very different than now. I don't work with corporations on this question. I challenge their claims. For example, the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, which is here based in Urbana-Champaign, um, and they have annually they put out their numbers. We helped this many companies, we saved this much money, and that equates to this many kilowatt hours saved, therms of energy, and greenhouse gas emissions reduced. Well, if those are straight multiplications and there's no accounting for what happened to the savings, those dollars were clearly not put away and untouched. Those dollars were respent somewhere. And without that accounting in a economy that has an average impact of 1 kilogram of CO2 per dollar, then you can't claim $10 million saved and not 10 million kilograms of CO2. So, and I've challenged Google publicly on some of their claims about we implement AI to help cities make their traffic more efficient, their traffic management more efficient, the street lights that manage urban traffic that reduces congestion by X amount, which has a Y amount CO2 reduction. Well, if you make traffic flow better in a city, that's civil engineering 101. You just incentivize people to drive instead of take public transit or walk or bike. That's demand management 101. So then the question is, what does the global economy do with those savings? When we reduce fuel use in one part of the global economy, what do fossil fuel companies do? Now we're back to economics 101. They drop the price and sell more. So for all of these cases, without a global commitment to a cap on economic size, we're at risk of all the savings being redeployed as growth somewhere in the system.
And so are you challenging those that you're engaging with to create their own cap? Or, I mean, because it'd be really hard for any one company or say the institute that you mentioned to set a global cap on their own. Like, are you looking at individuals? Are you looking at industries? Are you trying to influence, wider bodies to make these global cap kind of commitments? Like what's then therefore when you challenge them, what are you hoping comes out of it?
So I had an undergraduate student at Purdue do a little research. She checked 25 different brands' green claims and asked whether any of them considered this question in some way, somehow, of what happens to the savings. She only found one, and that was Honda. Honda has this econ button. If you have a Honda, there's a button you can hit econ mode. It kind of controls how fast you can accelerate and your braking for fuel efficiency. And on Honda's website about econ mode, there's a little disclaimer that says fuel savings induced by the econ mode is subject to how the driver responds to using econ mode. If you save fuel, but then if you're used to spending $20 on fuel every month and now you just drive more, then you didn't get any savings out of it. So only one, you could do what Honda does and have a disclaimer on your econ claims. Or what I would prefer is stop making those claims because they're not true. They're just marketing language. I always assume people working in sustainability, I always make the upfront assumption that people working in sustainability really care. They do want to see emissions go down. They do want to see us not destroy planet Earth. They want an equal access to human well-being for 9 billion people on planet Earth. And if that's true, then we'll have to factor in a limit on economic size into your work. I'm not here to tell. I think Degrowth Institute, if things go right for us in the next few years and this starts to pick up a little bit more, I think we can start putting effort into asking these questions. What are the best ways to tackle this in a corporate CSR team or even an environmental justice initiative? But right now we're focused on kind of the wake up moment about the global economy.
Well, and when it comes to that wake up moment, who would you say is currently the most likely to be positively engaging with you? Like, I can imagine you get some pushback, whatever. Everyone's going to get that depending on how they're approaching. But are there industries, are there companies, are there sustainability professionals? Like, are there certain archetypes that they're like, these are the groups that actually are really trying to engage with us and learn more, or actually they're really receptive to the challenge and now they're taking action? Like, where are you seeing the most, I guess, warm reception right now? And where do you think the wake up call will come from?
You got turned on to the term somehow, right? It came across your radar in an interview or in an how did it
I'll be honest, I don't really remember. I just know, like, I mean, I read pretty widely, and I obviously through this podcast, I'm talking to a lot of different experts in different fields. And degrowth is one of these things that's kind of come up because I think there are a lot of sustainable professionals who look at the work they're doing and be like, what was my impact? Right? Like, if I'm looking and I'm the head of a major supply chain, and I won't speak for anyone that's been on my podcast, but I've had some very large supply chains represented on this podcast. And I know through my own work with supply chains, as well as some of the conversations I've had, like, the question was, well, like, what has been my impact as a professional? And there has been, for what I'm seeing the last little bit, like, okay, then what does sustainability mean? And I think for a while it was like, this is a movement, like it's a rallying cry. But now it's become something like they're really looking at the impact more than anything else. And so there's like this question, even with all these gains, you call them savings, I'll call them gains. Um, we're still surpassing these limits. So therefore, I think that's actually made it easier for a lot of other professionals to kind of be like, there's no point. Right. So I feel like, and that's why I kind of like, it's an interesting time to be talking about these. Like, I don't know which one will win. I don't know why they'll win. I just know that everyone's on the field. And I generally believe that with the best of intentions, for the most part. Sure, there's some tourists. Sure, there's some people packing their CV with the latest, I'm DEI, I'm sustainability, I'm CSR. Like, we've always had an element of that, sure. But I think, like, the people I talk to, they genuinely are in this to try and have a positive impact on the world, on a system they're looking at, on a community that they're a part of. And they're, for the most part, all, I've never met one that's felt like they had it done. So they're all kind of on the journey, just trying to figure out, like, okay, what can I get done? So I also think, like, the other question I have in my head is like around timelines, because, and I think a lot about this because I think, like right now, a lot of people are saying ESG, sustainability, it's over, D&I, it's over. It's like, well, think back 20 years ago, where were we on any of those topics? And it was a very different world with very little traction, except for a few nutty people like Yvonne Chouinard and Ray Anderson. Well, now we have thousands of CEOs who've climbed onto different platforms and said, we're going to make these commitments. Okay, some fell off, sure, but there's a lot more now than there were before. But to your, I guess, maybe was it enough? Like, I think everyone will come back to that, right? And I guess my only hesitation to say it's not enough is I'm not sure we had enough time either. Like, I very much believe we're already past 1.5 anyway. So for me, it's more a matter of like, when can we crawl back, right, at the macro level? And I feel like degrowth is part of that. But I also think, like, degrowth as a topic gets really interesting in terms of the fact that we talk about, we're looking at a significant shift in jobs and technology and what society aims and aspires to. So now maybe actually that's kind of gets to my question about, like, are we reframing prosperity and success and meaning and as part of this? Because if so, then actually it's a really interesting time to be having discussions.
you gave your story version of the evolution of sustainability towards challenging endless economic growth and the need to talk about right sizing and realigning the economy back to that nested dependencies diagram because it's not there. That may be a nice, comfortable view of the economy. The economy is a subset of ecology, but not when the economy has outgrown the planet. The economy is biophysically outgrown the planet, and so yeah, I think now is the moment better than any to just say that very clearly and explicitly and out loud so that it doesn't get lost in this next evolution of sustainability in the way that it got lost to go back to earlier conversation, in the way that it got lost previously. You had the not only corporate sustainability, you had the voluntary simplicity movement, which feels a lot like the minimalist movement of today, and it never challenged the size of your bank account. It just asked you to change the things you consume, or live simpler. You had yes, your corporate sustainability, a la Ray Anderson, which didn't question the size of the global economy, or what the economy does with the efficiencies that you gain, and the financial savings that you gain. I remember reading about how um, Interface Carpet had their corporate sustainability retreat in Hawaii one year, and they brought a lot of sustainability voices, and Ray Anderson, no doubt, was a visionary. Absolutely. And I would just say, if he was still around, he was clearly a lifelong learner. I've read a few of his books. I lived in Atlanta for a bit. Ray Anderson Foundation does great work down there. And I think that next evolution would be talking about the size of the global economy, maybe in the way that Patagonia is. But um,
Well, I think Anderson did in terms of, say, oil and emissions. Like at some
uh
point, he
the
recognized that
climate
everyone's going to go to jail
specifically.
that emits, right? So
Mhm.
he saw that, but he was kind of like, I would say, he was more of he maybe was one of the founders of sustainability in the corporate, but he was actually much more of a circularity person. And I should disclaim, like, I've done a lot of work with Interface. I know all their people. Erin Mizan was my second interview, and she was a CSO. Like, I loved that brand. When I started Collective, my goal was only to work with brands like that cared. And what I realized is they don't spend money on consultants because they already know what they're doing. It's all the
Yeah,
ugly people, like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that have the
yeah.
money. Um,
But I think it's a
Actually,
great
I was
example.
I was gonna
I
think. Go for it.
Well, I'll just say, I think it's a great example of assuming people care, not even that, knowing that they do. And I just want to, I don't want to lose that, because I want to mention one other thing, which is one of our recommended readings in our work is Ishmael, which is Daniel Quinn's Ishmael, written in 1991. Had a huge influence on Ray Anderson and Interface. But if you go back and revisit Ishmael, it was a degrowth book. And so I think it's interesting that came out in the 90s. You had a whole crop of sustainability professionals read that book and get inspired to change their local actions. But I've said this before: think globally, act globally. That's the next evolution too.
When it comes to that, I kind of have like a nuanced question, which is it economic growth that's the problem, or is it the negative externalities that no one's held accountable for along that path that are the problem?
Let's say we accounted for those externalities in the price of things correctly, so that the price of things adequately reflects the cost of dealing with the impacts, whether it's carbon emissions, waste buildup, biodiversity loss, water use, toxic spreading. The cost of controlling those things, or limiting them, or monitoring them, or whatever you might imagine the actions of an ecological society and economy look like. Let's say all those costs were incorporated, and we had to do them on top of running the regular economy. That would look like a smaller economy. I mean, in an economy where we're used to maximizing, uh, minimizing care for the externalities, which I don't agree with that. I think we've had a lot of success incorporating. I think a lot of externalities, the price of externalities is well incorporated in many cases. But um, let's say we were to get them all, the result would be a smaller economy. And so, unless you say that explicitly and out loud, you're kind of pulling a fast one on people. You're kind of inserting a really big elephant in the room without acknowledging it. And that's all degrowth is. That's what the Degrowth Institute is saying, is that we have to say that sooner than later, so that in the next evolution, we act at a global scale.
Now, practically speaking, how does it come through at a global scale? Is it things like the EU Commission passing more regulations that has an impact on the way that business is done, or that Is it a moral framework that consumers adopt, or people like Ray Anderson adopt, like, minimalism for consumers and, leadership for Ray Anderson? Or is it something else? Like, what's the vehicle for adoption on this?
I don't think we have enough critical mass of conversation about the need to limit the size of the economy as we currently measure it and as we currently know it to get a good read on that. Like I can just say that in my main circles, which is kind of the last 10 years of growing awareness and activism around degrowth in the US, plus the engineering classroom, environmental engineering classroom, where I teach carbon accounting and I teach how to think about the macroeconomy. There's like classroom methods that have been really successful. It's not a large leap from standard carbon accounting and scope 1, 2, and 3 to scope 4, the global economy. It's not a huge leap. I've done it pretty successfully in the classroom. The activist community has been focused on uh, uncovering this reality about how the savings get redeployed. There's a lot of folks working on political and social policies that would help usher in a and support people, especially the least privileged and least resourced. But then there's like the global financial system. And I rarely come across people who can speak articulately on the global financial system and how that connects with limited growth. But as of this year, there's an organization based in Charlottesville, Virginia, called the Archita Institute that is dedicated to challenging the financial world with post-growth principles and degrowth advocacy. So I think that stuff is popping up. And we're having a gathering here in Chicago next week called D School. We'll have 100 people from mostly the US or North America who see the challenge to growth in their work somehow, some way, coming here to share knowledge. So just that is a sign.
You cap global economic growth. A lot of the global south could say, wait a second, you guys have already developed. I mean, I've been hearing this for 20 years on carbon. I can't imagine if you ask them to find a way to degrow or to reframe economic development. How are they going to take to this? Because I'm on the back of a scooter in Vietnam. This person's really full of pride they can afford a scooter after 20 years of hard work. And you're going to say, well, actually, your limits are going to be, here, whereas in the US and other parts, even if they stop, they're still going to be much higher than yours. How do we make sure that this is more just than that? And I ask that not as like a moral imperative, but just like something very practical, that if you can't, they're just going to ignore it, and they're not going to care what the costs are, because they're not going to feel it. It's going to be someone else across the globe that's going to feel it, in 50 years from now. So how do you help, or what's your thoughts on providing balance as part of that discussion?
Yeah, that question has to be asked. It's why the definition of degrowth we talk about is an intentional, which implies cooperation across the globe, intentional downscaling of the global economy for the purpose of ecological sustainability and social justice. If you lop off the social justice version of that definition, it's not degrowth anymore. It's austerity, or it's recession, or it's some other kind of top-down imposed economic course correction measure. It's not what we're bringing together people to talk about. The example of the person in Vietnam and the U.S. is a good one. I think it speaks to it's a good starting point to bring up the critique, and it definitely speaks to things like the international negotiations around the damage fund, the loss and damage fund, for example, and the international climate agreements or negotiations. But I mean, that example could be done right here in the city of Chicago. You don't have to look at US versus Vietnam. You can just look at class differences and access to wealth. You want to talk about historical responsibility. I think that gets brought up a lot too. You don't need to leave the city. Again, you don't need to leave any enclave that's not just a rich neighborhood in the United States to get that dynamic. And so that's why the Degrowth Institute is really focused on the US context, so that we can talk about the global north and the global south in the US. That's not just a political bounded term. It exists here, and it has to be brought up right away. But then again, to go back to my earlier definition, assuming sustainability advocates, or I should say our earlier mission statement, assuming sustainability advocates are for a just and ecological transition to sustainability that corrects for historical wrongs, then bringing up the way the macroeconomy works and the fact that their savings are redeployed to serve growth and that growth unequally serves the wealthy, um, that alone should be the conversion statement for your average sustainability professional to take whatever they're doing right now, figure out how it fits within a
And that leads me to my
just and
last
more
question,
ecological but
which is very
smaller
easy.
global
For
economy.
listeners who are kind of new to the concept or after listening to us are really interested in learning more, like where should they start? What should they explore? What should they read? And then what are maybe some of the questions they should ask themselves as they're trying to figure out how to incorporate this into their daily work, into their daily practice, into their mindset, into their communities?
I will make recommendations for our own stuff, but I would say at a larger scale, something a little bit more accessible and really influential is the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, and as well as The Serviceberry. And both of those touch on indigenous traditions in North America, connected with the kind of modern, more logo-centric, scientific-centric sustainability and environmental movement. And she's a great writer. So Braiding Sweetgrass and The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And then we have on our website, we have a toolkit page for some recommended readings, intro to degrowth, and then we have discussion guides for how to stimulate a degrowth conversation at your workplace, on your campus. And then I got to shout out to a few initiatives here in the U.S. that are contributing to the challenge to endless economic growth. CASI, I mentioned them in DC, the Center for Advancement of the Steady State Economy, Archita Institute, um, Post Growth Finance. Hoodwinked in the Hothouse is based out of New York, and they're working on exposing the false narrative behind climate action in some cases. The Post Growth Institute out on the West Coast, Leadership for the Ecozoic Program at University of Vermont, and then the International Degrowth Network would be kind of like the global clearinghouse, degrowth.info and International Degrowth Network, IDN. Those two websites have great references on degrowth.